Hello. In this video, we will examine Italian and Spanish Baroque art and culture from the 17th century. As we talked about in class, Baroque style um, really is varied from culture to culture, from group to group. The more traditional style of Baroque art, the more ornamental style of Baroque art, is very strongly connected to the Italian Baroque. Um, and that has a lot to do with the reason behind what happened to formulate Baroque. Um, Baroque style is usually seen as an attempt to restore the church's cultural dominance and centrality, to restore the influence that the church had enjoyed for more than 1,000 years. In the 17th century, and even in sometime before that, there had been a movement away from the centralized authority, cultural authority of the church in Europe. The especially in areas farther to the north, where the Protestant Reformation was begun and had a much stronger influence. The imagery and culture created really was moving away from the religious subject matter and away from the Renaissance style and moving towards a simpler, more accessible style, like we saw, a more realistic style, a more common sort of everyday life subject matter and theme, like we saw with that of the Dutch. But in Italy, the the church was such a strong dominant force, and the Renaissance was still such an important influence over the artist of the Baroque of the 17th century, that um, we don't see the same change, the same evolution of style and subject matter. But what does happen is there's an attempt made, especially in architecture, but also in sculpture and painting through the use of sculpture and painting, to revitalize, to refurbish, to restore some of the grandeur of art and culture, and especially of religious art and culture. Now, when we think about Italian Baroque, what we have to understand is that it's not the same approach that we might think of in previous cultures and generations and eras, especially in terms of architecture. Italian Baroque um, is an extension. It's a continuation of some of what we saw in the Renaissance, but it's taking it to a higher level of ornamentation, of detail, and adding what a lot of um, a lot of artists felt was missing from previous generations, and that's a vitality, a liveliness to the designs and to the decorative elements. Now, we can tell a Baroque structure or a Baroque refurbishment because that happens quite often during this period, where an older structure would be updated using this new Baroque style. And we can always tell that because what's happening is they're taking the classic elements of architecture, columns, pilasters, pediments, and they are using them in a new way. Now, the most important of the Italian Baroque architects was Carlo Maderno. Moderno became famous not necessarily just for his uh, standalone new structures, new construction, but really more importantly for adding the decorative elements, the new Baroque style to pre-existing structures. So, for instance, by adding a facade, by re-emphasizing the entrance to the church, what you create is a more impressive structure without really dramatically changing it. You just simply, add surface decoration and ornamentation to the church, to a church that already exists, and you make it new. Now, the the most important element often of Baroque architecture is the use of a variety of levels and depths and things that we weren't used to seeing, like curves and more ornate and more organic shapes and lines. So in this case, the elements are relatively simple and relatively familiar. We have columns, a variety actually of types of columns. We have pilasters, which are the kind of squared off attached columns. We have pediments, a variety of multiple pediments at various levels. We have sculptural niches that are capped by pediments. There's arches, there's tympanum, there's all the detail and elements that are very familiar. It's just using them in combination and the way that they were applied to this building. So basically, he didn't change anything about the structure itself. He just added all this and stuck it onto the front of a much older, simpler Romanesque church and really made it more beautiful, more interesting. Now, Moderno's most famous commission was to revitalize the front facade of St. Peter's Basilica. And you can tell the elements that he's added. He's added all the columns, he's added the triangular pediment, he's added the whole top level of the facade with the two clocks and all the sculpted elements. All of that is new. Now, what's interesting about this is that these facades made the structures seem bigger, more imposing, but they all tended to alter the proportions. And because it is just a facade, it's a false front. It suggests something that's not really there. He didn't make the structure behind it any bigger. He just made the facade seem more impressive. And, what makes Baroque style so notable, and what we remember most about it, is all of the ornamentation. Like we talked about in class in the lecture, it's very much about how Baroque tends to be remembered as very ornate and lots of things going on the surface, and that is definitely true. But it's really only Italian Baroque that is truly notable for that. Um, it's very much uh, an exaggerated romantic realism. It is it's intended to be emotional and inspirational and to create kind of an ecstatic feeling within the viewer. Now, in terms of new architecture, we have the works of Borromini. Borromini became famous for his chapels, his new churches that really do challenge the notion of what we're used to thinking of with the traditional post and lintel style architecture. So instead of taking the kind of traditional flat front, the traditional Greek temple front, or anything traditional about the form at all, he uses a variety of different geometries, overlays of circle and square and curve and arc to create this really amazing and intricate style of architecture. What you're looking at in the image on the left is actually the front facade. So as you enter this chapel of St. Ivo, it's the courtyard kind of extends out and around these arms of rows of arches and columns that extend out around this courtyard and creates this sort of enclosed but outdoor space. It's not a traditional facade like we're used to thinking of. It's more kind of classic in that villa style. The chapel itself is not quite a rotunda. It's actually of a multiple kind of quatrefoil shape around this very unique dome structure that's capped by the spiral finial. And it's not, it's really like nothing we've ever seen before. Every surface has been augmented, designed, detailed in a way to add richness, to add beauty. And this is really what we think of when we think of Italian Baroque, is this overabundance of ornamentation and detail. Um, Now, Borromini became famous for his view of architecture, really more like sculpture. The building becomes a sculpture. So we see the facade on the left gets curved and bent and pushed and pulled. The details are really, really amazing in the way that everything is sculpted, including the coffered ceiling inside the dome, including the light and the way that the light is becomes an element, becomes a design element through the windows, and it, the light shines on very specific locations, like that uh, gold star or sunburst in the top of the dome that surrounds the dove of the Holy Spirit. Now, these structures were a real departure from what had come before. Uh, in terms of architecture, the Renaissance was pretty classic. It was pretty straightforward. It really didn't take a lot of risks, but Baroque was willing to do that. And I think the reason why that Baroque artists were able and willing to take these risks is because the church needed to be relevant again. The church needed to be at the forefront again. It needed to lead. And it was trying to sort of reclaim that authority, to reclaim that cultural leadership at a time when we're really seeing a shift more towards Northern Europe. This is going to be the period where the French are really going to take the lead away from Italy. Italy had been the center of the art world for some time, but we're going to see that shift and change, and Paris becomes the real center as we move into the late 17th and early 18th century in art and culture. We're going to see that shift towards Paris as the center of the art world, as the leaders of the art world, but not without the church making that effort to try and keep control of art and culture in Italy. Now, um, like during the Renaissance, artists were expected in their time in the 17th century, artists were expected to be able to do and create in a variety of media and a variety of techniques. One of the most versatile artists of the Baroque is a man by the name of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. Bernini was an architect and a sculptor and even dabbled in painting some. He's most famous, I suppose, for his uh, carved marble sculptures. Now, I think what makes Bernini so interesting is how he viewed architecture very much like a sculpture, because sculpture inhabits space and it exists in three dimensions and in the round, and that's a big part of its effect. He saw buildings as having to or needing to reflect that same approach. So as Moderno was charged with reimagining, reinventing the facade of St. Peter's, Bernini was charged with adding and adding importance and elements, design elements to the courtyard of St. Peter's. So what you're looking at here is the piazza in front of St. Peter's Basilica, and Bernini had a great vision, a great idea behind adding grandeur to the scene. You'll notice that the street that comes from the river goes straight into and follows the axis of the lines of the piazza, and so as you approach along this long, straight boulevard and enter the courtyard, the buildings and the colonnade that surrounds the circular courtyard, circular piazza, with the obelisk at the center and the spread wings of the arches in the even on the tile of the pavers. All of that is very orderly. It's very regular, and it seems like it makes complete and total design sense. Well, that's all the work of Bernini. In fact, he actually went so far as to have the city of Rome and the Vatican to to change the path and direction of that street. That street, the boulevard, as you approach, that was not there. So they moved the street. They knocked the buildings down, and so now the most direct route, as you walk towards St. Peter's, you get this grand experience of seeing the building from a great distance and then opening up into this big piazza, and it's very impressive. And then you see the facade of St. Peter's, and it's really a remarkable sight. And that's what Bernini he wanted to create a grand experience, and he saw art and architecture as being very experiential. And so the artist's role in communicating style and technique was all about creating this idea in the mind of the viewer that the objects themselves were not just simply what they were, that they were a part of this big story and that the viewer is a part of that story. And we see that not just in the grand gestures and the grand opulence, not just in Bernini's architecture, but also in his sculpture. Inside St. Peter's, he was tasked with creating this altar decoration called the baldacchino. It is massive. I mean, it's hard to underplay and understate how large St. Peter's Basilica is. It really is one of the largest churches ever built, and it is incredibly beautiful and opulent. And a lot of that has to do, a lot of that, the credit for that goes to Bernini. He created the baldacchino, which is the sculpture that stands over the altar, reminiscent of the tent of the Israelites that they built when they brought back the Ark of the Covenant, and the first creating the first temple in the Old Testament. And it's supposed to resemble a tent with the spiraled and twisted columns, the over ornate structure. In the roof of this sculpture. This is really just a sculpture. It very definitely has a an architectural feel to it, but it's not that. It's not part of the building. It is a freestanding sculpture that decorates the altar area. Now, what what made Bernini so great was his vision. And I think that he was able to envision objects and spaces that others perhaps were not. He was able to create an idea of something so overwhelmingly grand and beautiful that the viewer just could not help but be moved. What he wants to do is um, to show the ecstasy and fervor of belief. And that's a theme in his work. Now, that extended both on inside to sculptures and in piazzas. Bernini became very famous for his sculpted fountains. All around Rome, he carved and created fountains to decorate in piazzas. You know, we tend to think about Italian Baroque as focusing on the church, but it was also a civic pride. The renewal in Rome, the renewal in Florence, the renewal in Venice and Milan, and extending to every major city in Italy. They're vying for dominance and control and interest and they do that through a great expansion of public works and public art. So, especially in Rome, the fountains of Rome date back to the Roman Empire. By this point, they are, 2,000 or so years old, and many of them were relatively simple, very functional structures, these fountains. They were still in use in the 17th century. People didn't necessarily have running water, and so they would go to the fountains to draw water. They would use the fountains as drinking water, as cooking water, and so this was a very public space, a very public structure. But they weren't very ornate and they weren't very beautiful. They were just really functional. So the city fathers of Rome and Venice and Florence, they all decided to try and encourage more public art. And in Rome, it was really about these fountains. And the fountains take on such a variety of forms and shapes. Some are inspired by classical mythology. Some are inspired by the obelisks that you might see in ancient Egypt. Just such a mixture of influences and cultural traditions and history that are all brought together in this opulence of the Italian Baroque. Now, there are a couple of sculptures that Bernini is sort of most famous for, and this is one. This is his version of David. Now, we've seen several versions of David throughout history. David is the Old Testament figure. He's very famous for his battle versus Goliath. David is also a very popular figure in Christian and Jewish history because he represents sort of someone very relatable. He was flawed, and yet he was courageous. He was the hero, and in some stories, he at some points in his own story, he's the villain. He's indulgent, and yet he's exuberant. He represents everything great about humanity and everything wrong with humanity. And that's partly why I think David has maintained his importance and status in Christian theology and belief for so long, especially because people can relate to him. Now, in the various versions of sculptures of David, we've seen secular humanism like Michelangelo. We've seen accuracy like Donatello in the Renaissance. We've seen all kinds of different approaches to trying to get the image to match the story, to trying to tell the story very dramatically, to try and make it look very classical. Well, Bernini chooses the realism of the Renaissance. He wants his sculptures to feel extraordinarily real. But what he adds to it is the drama, the theatricality. We see Bernini's David in the act of throwing the sling, or about to throw, or using the sling, I should say, to throw the stone to defeat Goliath. His face and jaw show resolution. His body's coiled. He's got all of the details and accuracy of the form that you would expect and hope to find in a master of technique, a master of carving of marble. What makes Bernini's sculptures so remarkable was his ability to give a fluidity, to give a reality, a kinetic sense of movement. His sculptures look as if they are frozen in movement in time. And we haven't seen that level of kind of energy and movement in sculpture since the great Greek sculptors of the high classical, Polykleitos and Myron. Now, Bernini sculptures often, not only did they include the figures or the sculpture itself, but he also often thought about the way that you viewed the sculpture. He saw it as an opportunity not just to create a freestanding object, but to create an experience. So here in his Ecstasy of St. Teresa, you see the angel visiting St. Teresa and gifting her with the gift of the stigmata, the signs. And she is so ecstatic in her faith and fervor in her faith that her heart is pierced by an arrow. We actually see the angel wielding the arrow to pierce her heart, and she's caught in the throes of this ecstatic belief. And Bernini actually, he intended the sculpture not to be viewed really in the round, but in in relief, almost in very, very high relief, against and surrounded by this incredibly elaborate staging. So he not only did he carve the sculpture, but he carved the surround. He created the experience. Those golden rods, which are actually gold, that come down from heaven, that are supposed to be the light of God. And he actually even went so far as to cut a window in the side of St. Peter's to allow light to enter and be reflected off mirrors down along those golden rods to create this experience of light reflecting off of the tile, which is and the marble, which is supposed to kind of look like a night sky. And so he's really thinking very carefully about not just the object itself, but how it's going to be presented to the viewer and how that presentation can affect the viewer. You see it as more beautiful, more opulent, more perfect because of the way that he's presenting it. Now, in terms of painting, what's interesting about Italian painting from the Baroque is how kind of pastoral it is and varied. We don't see one consistent style. We see kind of a different approach. In in certain artists, we see a reflection more of a late Renaissance. In some artists, we see a reflection of mannerism. And in some artists, we see a reflection of a more later style, a post-mannerist style, like we might see in the late 16th century, the late 1500s. Artists like Annabella Carracci, they're trying to take that religious subject matter in the foreground, the flight into Egypt, Mary and Jesus, the baby, the infant Jesus, and Joseph are fleeing towards Egypt. And in the background is this very pastoral, very beautiful landscape scene. So landscape is becoming very important in painting. The settings behind, the space. Notice just how wide open and big that and deep that space is. That's something that we hadn't seen in painting, really. Space had generally been flatter. And when there was expanses of space, it was still dominated, the compositions were still dominated by the figures, rather than seeming in proportion and creating a great expanse of space and have shallow foreground areas. Now, we definitely still see in the style and techniques of the Italian Baroque the effects of the Renaissance. The chiaroscuro of Leonardo da Vinci and his light and dark, the hazy atmospheric perspective, the use of strong and powerful expression, like we might see in Raphael, the use of the um, the very kind of monumental figures like we might see in a Michelangelo. So all of these stylistic and technical influences from the previous generations of art and painting are coming through. But the it's not a it's not a classicism. It's not a humanism like we might see in the Renaissance. It's more drama. It's more story. It's more narrative. And that's what's really important. So these are religious works mostly, but what we're seeing is sort of almost a heightened theatricality in the work. So the light's very focused, the colors are very rich, the figures are arranged to attract the attention to the most of the viewer compositionally to the focal points, and we see these over exaggerated expressions, and that's ultimately what we're going to see as Italian Baroque. Overwhelming the viewer, over exaggerating. Now, sort of the most important Italian Baroque painter was a man by the name of Caravaggio. Caravaggio was kind of a scoundrel. He represents the Baroque and the excesses of the Baroque very well. He actually was threatened with excommunication. He was banished from several cities. He was convicted of murder, which ultimately he lost his life to that conviction. But he's quintessential Baroque. It's excess. It's do everything as big and bold and brash as you can do it, and live fully. Just like Bernini and his image of David, which is popular. The thematically and what we see in Caravaggio's work is this return over and over to the idea that God can use even the sinner, that God calls the lowly to do his work. God can convert anyone. God can reclaim anyone. And that's ultimately a powerful message of the Italian Baroque, the idea of reclamation, the idea of restoration. And so here, the conversion of St. Paul, the story says that Saul was on the road to Damascus when he was struck down by a loud voice and a great light fall from his horse. He's blinded temporarily, and he's inspired by the voice asking him, why are you persecuting my people and me to convert to Christianity, and becomes this great evangelist. And that's ultimately, Caravaggio loves the idea. He loves the thought that one could just decide to change and then set about going, uh, becoming devout, becoming worthy, becoming more than you were. He liked calling images. He liked using light. You notice there's a lot of directed light in his paintings. So it's not just light and dark, kind of for light and dark's sake. It's it's just a different sort of approach to that, the use of that light and dark, and we see it. He'll be influential in later generations of romantic artists who will borrow from his use of light. And it's almost, like I said, very theatrical. It looks like a stage, these images. This is his calling of St. Matthew. And the figure in the shadow to the right with the kind of real subtle halo is Jesus. And he's reaching his hand out. And you notice the gesture with how Jesus reaches. He doesn't quite point. It's sort of this vague kind of gesture. And if you notice, you look carefully at the way that his hand is shaped and the way he reaches, it's almost reminiscent of Michelangelo's painting of Adam and how he reaches toward God. But the role is reversed here. So here Jesus reaches out with this sort of nonchalant hand. And Matthew doesn't look up. Matthew's the one at the end of the table, despondently looking down, while the others are trying to figure out who Jesus is pointing at and talking to tell him to follow him. And it's all set in Caravaggio's day. You notice that they're not dressed as first century Jews. They're dressed in the garb and style of Caravaggio's time, because for him, this is about taking the stories of Christianity and making them relevant again, and making them and updating them, and making them appropriate and meaningful to the people of his time. That we're all called, that we're all flawed, that we're all sinners, and that that's the message that the church wants to send to people. That we know that society forces us or causes us to be sinners and causes us to be tempted, and yet we have a choice. Look up, follow Jesus' call, or stay in the shadows. Now, Caravaggio was off and on a devout Catholic, but he was definitely a moral person. He believed that the moral lessons of the day, the attempts at reformation, the attempts to combat uh, the indulgence and the over opulence of society were important. And so some of his themes really reflect that. Here, in a painting called The Card Sharps, we see these two worldly gentlemen kind of who are cheating in cards, the younger, innocent, fresh-faced young man. And I mean, the cheating is incredibly rampant and blatant, that he's going to, take his money in this card game. Now, Caravaggio, throughout the course of his career and life, um, he would have seen an image like this as representing this new morality. It was no longer just, oh, well, Jesus tells us to love everybody and to not do these certain things. But, how do we And we want to do that generally, but how do we approach that? How do you make it relevant for today? Because the church in their time was starting to be seen as outdated, out of touch with the common everyday people. And Caravaggio was, that those common people, those everyday people, those sort of lower ends of society, those were his niche, those were his people. And so he chooses to paint images that would have been scandalous. Here we have, they're gambling, they're playing cards, they're cheating, there's no integrity, it's dishonest, it's wrong. And yet, Caravaggio says, even in that we can learn. We can learn not just, you know, that gambling is wrong or cards are wrong, but how we treat each other is what really ultimately matters. I haven't looked at too many women artists just yet. And women artists have always been with us. They've lacked a voice. Art was not seen as an appropriate profession for a woman or occupation for a woman. So it's rare that a woman's skill or talent would be rewarded with commissions. The art world was very controlling. And most often, women were not allowed to train as artists unless, like Gentileschi, they were the daughter of an artist who would train them. Artemisia Gentileschi was a really an interesting artist for her time. She really enjoyed painting images that depicted women in roles of power, that depicted women as strong and courageous. She was almost like an early feminist, basically, in her choices of subject matter. Now, she's not necessarily inventing these, it's just choosing to what to paint. So this is Judith slaying Holofernes, this classic Greek tale of the fair, Judith cutting the head off of Holofernes. And, she shows all the gruesome, gory details, the blood spurting, and it's it's very dramatic. And I think, again, it shows that style, that Italian Baroque style. Gentileschi uh, was almost lost. I mean, while her images show a great high level of technique, they were so radical and so challenging that they weren't really recognized in their own time. She also dealt a lot thematically with the relationship between men and women, and how society viewed that relationship over time. She chose to tell stories and choose as subject matter stories where um, where women were in this as part of the story. Women were sometimes mistreated by men, but then the men were always found out, and there was retribution. So overall, the style is very technical. It's very realistic, similar to what we might see in the Renaissance. But it's the pose, it's the posture, it's the details that really show off the Baroque style. Now, when we move into Spain, because Spain is kind of caught in between. It's not Northern Europe like France and the Dutch and the English, and it's not Italy. So Spain tends to have a little bit of elements of both. And during the 17th century, Spanish painting in particular was very contemplative. It was calmer. It was um, it was more internally focused rather than externally focused. Was not nearly as dramatic, although it had some dramatic elements. Some technique similarities in the use of light and dark and color, but some differences in in the approach, and in the message behind it. The two main painters of the Spanish Baroque are Francisco de Zurbarán and Diego Velázquez. De Zurbarán painted very often images of Franciscan monks contemplating death, of these, you know, these religious figures and their focus on leading kind of the Stoic life, um, the missionary life. This is also a great time of great expansion of missionaries and the role of missionaries all around the world, especially Spanish missionaries. And so here we have St. Francis holding a skull, and he's thinking about death. You can imagine him just contemplating death and perhaps um, praying about, to understand life and death, to understand heaven and hell, to understand our role in all of this. And it's a simple painting, but it's one that reflects this very Spanish approach that you don't look outward for stimuli, you don't look outward for answers, but the answers are found within. These themes were popular because um, the Spanish are different. They have a different approach to culture. They are not historically sort of at the forefront the way that the Italians were, but they're very devout, and they're also a little bit more isolated. The Iberian Peninsula, separated by the Alps and the Pyrenees Mountains from both Italy and France, is it's separate. It develops its own culture and its own version of Christianity, reflected in what we see with Baroque art and painting. Now, on the flip side of that, where Zurbaran is the more contemplative religious painter, Diego Velázquez is the court painter. Court painter is a painter who works at court, who lives basically in the palace, and they are constantly working and creating art for the purposes of a king or leader. And in this case, Velázquez is the court painter to Spanish kings, and as court painter, he would have been charged or was charged with painting royal portraits, with painting historical scenes, like we see here, the Surrender of Breda, with painting images of Spanish culture that show civic pride, that show national pride, that support through the imagery and propaganda the importance and the focus on the role of the monarchy and the great deeds done in the name of Spain. Now, for Velázquez, he loved to create layers of imagery. So there's usually almost always a foreground scene and then a middle ground scene and a background scene, or at the very least a foreground and a background scene. And they're connected, but they're different. And he loved to kind of play with the idea of an image within an image within an image. So even though we see the surrender happening here in the foreground, the battle's still going on in the background. And so, that's ultimately what would have attracted Velázquez to this type of scene is, you see the fires of the battle in the background, you see this wide expanse of landscape, you see all these things happening, and then in the foreground you see the fanciful soldiers greeting each other while, all that's going on in the background. Velázquez was notable for his attention to detail, for his use of light and color and texture, for his compositions, where he liked to kind of show off that he was able to rotate things in images. The horse looks away and the people look every which way. It seems very candid, very natural, and that's a big part of his style and technique. This is perhaps his most famous work. It's called Las Meninas, or The Little Princess. And what we're seeing here is an image within an image within an image, right? So we're in the foreground area, and we look out on what's happening kind of around us. We see the little princess waiting her turn to be placed into a painting, to be posed for that painting. We see her ladies in waiting. On the left, we see the big canvas of the painting that, in theory, he's making. It's a This is sort of an image within an image here. And we see standing behind the canvas a self-portrait of Velázquez at work. And then on the back wall behind everybody in the mirror reflected is a scene of the king and queen. So you have that double royal portrait. You have the portrait of uh, the child. You have the self-portrait of Velázquez. You have all of these elements all happening at once. And then you even throw in a little bit of genre style stuff with the dog, with the members of court, with the nurse, with the all of these elements come together to create a really unique painting in terms of the history of painting. So we didn't have anything like this. Nobody had ever tried to be this creative before. And that's ultimately what makes Velázquez so interesting, is his willingness to experiment and create, but not quite in the same way as what we would see in Italy. Now, Italian and Spanish Baroque are famous because of the the continuation of the Renaissance techniques, but added to that with this attention to detail and this opulent and indulgent decoration. We'll see the Baroque style become influential a couple hundred years later in the 19th century with the rise of the Romantics. All right, so this rounds out our look at the Baroque. Be sure that you're studying those notes. Go back to the initial notes page and pay attention to the artists and their works that they're most famous for, and be sure and study those images off your slide list.